This episode is sponsored by Northeast Ford and Catskill View Weddings. Hey Mary, how's it going?
It's going great. And we have a wonderful episode for our listeners today with Judith Monachina.
Now, Judith, I knew a little bit, but you know a lot of it. So why did you ask Judith to join us for this episode?
So when I asked Judith didn't quite think she had Moxie.
No.
And I saw a very different Judith through my work with her when I was working at Housatonic Valley Regional High School at the Career Experience program. She was the contact person for an internship that we did together with Peter Vermillier, who was a past guest on this podcast. And I really admired Judith's mentorship level.
Right. Yep.
And I would say to the students, you don't know what you have here in a boss. She is the real deal. And this is a very special experience that you might not be able to replicate for a while. I mean, I know my boss at Wendy's was not a Judith Monachina in high school. But Judith has a very, very eclectic past.
She does, for sure.
She does. She was a career counselor at Columbia. She also was awarded a Fulbright that she'll hopefully tell us about, doing research on Jews in fascist Milan, Italy, which is super interesting. And she also is the director of the Housatonic Heritage Oral History Center at Berkshire Community College. And so she is gathering stories of Moxie all the time. And I think that's another interesting perspective that she brings, the gatherer of Moxie stories.
And I think that was, also why we thought of her as having her own Moxie, because she's bringing Moxie of the past back to, the present.
Exactly. And just the number of times she's pivoted and switched gears indicates that Moxie can be very quiet and unassuming and capable. And that is Judith.
Enjoy.
Enjoy.
Northeast Ford offers great sales and service, including a no-charge pickup and delivery for any service, even with oil changes. And they offer 2-year unlimited oil changes with any vehicle purchase, new or pre-owned.
Northeast Ford makes buying, selling, or trading in your car super easy. They have charging stations for your electric vehicle and a ready cash now offer and vehicle check on the spot if you wish to sell your vehicle. And they provide help with all the paperwork.
They service 6 counties, and they are located at 182 Route 44 in Millerton, where you can swing by and see Lan and his great sales team.
Or visit them online at www.northeastfordmillerton.com.
Our next sponsor is someone that I have a personal connection with. Catskill View Weddings and Event is where I got married. Mary, you were one of our guests.
I was one of your guests, and I have to tell you, you making your grand entrance on the crest of the hill during sunset was pretty dramatic.
On horseback, too?
On horseback, and I nudged my husband and said, why didn't we do this?
Well, it is, we made some beautiful photos that are on the website that Catskill View uses, and there have been some other beautiful, beautiful weddings there, but the selling point is definitely the view. It is a 360-degree unobstructed view of the Catskill Mountain Range, sometimes you can see the Ashwaubekonks down in New Paltz all the way up to Albany. But the sunset there is spectacular, and we were so lucky when we got married in October with the foliage and the sun, and almost all of our friends and families' profile pictures for the next 6 months were with the sunset and the view. And to learn more, please visit www.catskillviewweddings.com.
And by the way, Thorin is still married.
Yes.
So, Judith, the first thing we like to start with is what you believe your definition of Moxie is, what you think of when you hear that word, and how you've exhibited Moxie in your own life.
So I looked it up because I wasn't really sure what the word was. I picture someone more outgoing, more extroverted, more physically bold, maybe wears hot pink. I pictured something very different from myself with that word. So when I found the word pluck, and faces dangerous or difficult situations with good attitude or something like that. So, yeah, I've met a lot of people who have that. And immediately what came to mind was this, and I'm thinking of the pluck in facing difficult situation, not the hot pink. There's a person who recently, we're doing this project where we're collecting oral histories of paper makers. And because this was a region that had a lot of paper mills, and they were mostly closing. And one woman and man who were employees at one of the paper mills. One was a chemical engineer. They were both engineers, but and one worked in more in the outward facing part of the business. And they decided to purchase the paper mills they were working in. It was a huge, bold move. All the others in town were closing, and they decided to purchase. And it took a good year or more to work it through. The company didn't really want to sell it to them because they could make more money selling to another company that might pay more. But they persisted, and they were able to purchase it, and they've been running it since 2009.
Oh, so this was recent. I was thinking like 1800s.
No. But those people in the 1800s, I mean, they were so full of moxie. I mean, what pluck and I think just the sense of being able to do, and was that period of time during the Industrial Revolution and afterwards, that where people felt that they could do these things. It seems to me, I don't know if that's true, but starting up a little tiny paper mill on the banks of a river and getting the machinery and making it and bringing in some people to do the work, that seems like real pluck, and they all had it. There were 26 or something in the town of Lee, 50 something in the county. They all had this always looking to the horizon for what might be a disruptor, even though they didn't have that word then, and always paying attention to possible new products. But they had this incredible drive to do this thing, to make this work.
So the paper couple, not that they're a couple, the two,
right,
the man and the woman in Lee, what motivated them to want to save this company?
Well, it's interesting because I think the motivation wasn't exactly that. It was, I think, you'd have to ask them. I did interview them, and what I got from them is that they thought it was a good business venture.
Okay.
And they thought they could do it. And they were, of course, nervous, but they knew that the paper mill that they were purchasing, the rest of them were closing. The companies were closing them, but for some reason they put this one on the market. They knew that it was, quote unquote, a gem. They knew that it had a business that was sustainable. They had a lot of different products. It wasn't one product driven kind of paper mill. So if one market goes away, they had other markets. They were always developing new markets and new products. So they knew it could work. And of course, they had 100 employees or something that I'm sure that entered into it, and it did. They knew that it had always been a place where people made a good living, and they liked that history.
Right.
So, yeah.
So in your work as the director of the Oral History Project, do you find that you're attracted to stories of moxie, or that you have an ear for that?
Well, I guess I'm attracted to a lot of stories, but I'll tell you, yes. I think everyone has this moxie to some degree, and it plays out in different ways. Do they defend their kid in school when the kid is being, harassed or not getting the right education? Or I think everybody has it to what you're calling moxie to some degree, right?
Right.
And those stories are always inspiring.
Right.
So I do think it's fun to stumble upon those. But I'll tell you, back in the day when I started the Italian project, which was about Italian Jews who lived through the Second World War and fascism, I started that project by I had interviewed a priest, and he had worked in a church where people had been rescued during the German occupation. And I was very interested in courage at the time. Courage. And then I started interviewing people who had survived, and I was still kind of noticing the courage that it takes to do that too. And your life is at risk, and you're going out in the street and getting a false document somewhere, or you're bringing your children somewhere where they'll be safe. It takes an awful lot of courage. And everyone I asked about that said, no, it's not courage. This is not courage. This is what you do. So it's interesting when what we might call something, the people themselves might not see it that way.
Interesting. Well, I think Mary and I, when we started this, one of the reasons we asked people to define what they define as moxie, I think you've defined it in about 3 different ways based on your input from some of these historical figures. And I think that's, how diverse it is and how we look at it. So I think that's so fascinating what you just said about that.
Thank you.
So Judith, I want to come back to that point that you made about people observing that they were just doing what needed to be done and didn't consider it courage, or what we might call moxie. And I wonder if we can explore that a little bit about how moxie is a label we put on something that we observe someone else doing when they're just doing what they think needs to be done.
Yeah.
Do you have any perspective on that?
Well, yeah. And not just in terms of courage, in terms of, survival or anything, but just how we sort of stumble through our lives. And sometimes we make these decisions that might look to others like, wow, that was brave, but it was just a stumble or it could be even naivete, like thinking about, not in terms of the survival, talking about that is a whole other thing. But talking about people doing things that look like moxie, like starting a company or taking a trip around the world in a sailboat or something, whatever it is. But I think we look at it from the outside, but to them, it may just be the next natural step, or naivete. Like I was thinking about how at the beginning of the Italian project, I had worked at a weekly newspaper, and I was accustomed to calling people, and asking, for information. That's how we learned in those days. And I must say, I'm happy that I didn't do that work when the internet was so ubiquitous, because I would have learned more. I would have looked online first and all that. I think it takes a lot longer that way, but we call people up. And I remember making an appointment to see the president of the Union of Italian Jewish Communities in Rome. And, he kind of looked at me like, wow, why is she here? And I remember noticing that when I was on my way out. I had this interview, I had my notebook. We spoke English because my Italian was still really bad. And I just remember him looking at me in a sort of puzzlement and thinking, wow, afterwards, yeah, I guess I don't know. I was naive. That's why I made that appointment with this sort of big shot,
Right.
And so I wonder how much of that. Now, a better example to me of moxie would be when I was thinking about moxie, I was thinking about these 2 grandmothers. One of them was the first one in her family to go to college, great grandmother. And she also divorced before people were doing that regularly. And this other grandmother who was an immigrant who lived in Sicily, and she came to the US with one of her children. She left her husband and 2 of her children behind, came here and worked for a year, and then saved money and went back and came back. She went back 3 times.
Wow.
On these awful boats, not knowing the first time at all where she was going. Imagine leaving everything, they were surviving, obviously. He had a trade, my great grandfather, but she really had moxie. Wow.
Right.
Those immigrants from Ireland, from everywhere that came here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other point that you made is that we see the final culmination of moxie, the final act, but we don't see those incremental baby steps that led the person to that thing. And I think in our kind of results-driven culture, we don't focus on the practice and the hours or the small risks that led to this seemingly biggest one.
That's a really good point. And that's why oral history is so interesting, because you can draw that out, even if the person wasn't aware of those small steps as being part of a bigger process. They can talk about it because they did it.
Right.
And those who are aware of the process, like the woman and the man who bought Onyx, bought a paper mill and named it the new business, and they're running it. I was able to talk about small steps. Well, he came into my office and said, what do you think of this? And I said, no way. I have 2 kids. I have, she told me about the process, and it's fascinating to see how people make decisions like that,
So, why do you think oral history is so important in telling people's tales of moxie or accomplishment or just hardship? What attracts you to it?
Well, I'm attracted because I think they're all very interesting stories, and that's how I sort of probably got into it. But I think people really like to listen to people's stories, in whatever way it is, whether it's watching a fictional, Netflix drama or something. It has to be kind of real enough for people to think it's a real story. I think
Right.
that's just what we do, is we get our inspiration. I know I get my inspiration from other characters. I'm reading is it Natalie Goldberg? I'm reading her, and I read her sort of every night thinking, this is what I want to be, more like Natalie Goldberg,
Right.
And I do that with movies too. And I just sort of really inspire. People are inspiring. I think it's also, important. And it's the reason I got into the paper mills. And that's how I first got introduced to Housatonic Heritage. They were early supporters of it. So I knew that, so my father had worked in the paper mills, and he had a situation when he was a young man where his father had a heart attack and he had to support his family. Suddenly, he wasn't able to go to college, and it was a dream of his, and he was going to be the first person in his family to go to college. So he was heartbroken, but he went to work after high school. During high school, actually, he worked 40 hours a week. And then after high school, he went to work at the paper mill in town. And he, through really hard work, really native intelligence, and a strong work ethic, he was able to really work himself into a position that was very, 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 a very good, solid, we're professional position. And it was also very interesting. I found paper to be very, very interesting. And I heard about it through him. I knew that those stories, that oftentimes we have this idea of what industry is. In our culture, we don't have it in high regard. We think of it as monotonous, or the jobs on the, we think of it, we don't understand how interesting some of these places are. And so I wanted to go in there and just simply document, what do these people do? What does it look like? I knew most people didn't know. So that's how that was motivated. It was just, I want people to know that this product is really fascinating, that making something out of almost nothing that can be used in many different ways, in ways that we don't even know where paper is existing in our daily lives, like airplanes and brakes and cars and things like that. And so I just wanted people to know those stories. That was the motivation about that project. And that was naive, because I had never held a video camera. So I hired someone to do it, and I didn't really know how to. Anyway, that is, especially when it comes to industry, because I think industry is fascinating. So I just want people to know.
You've said the word naive.
I was
twice.
just going to ask about that too.
Thorin, go for it.
No, you brought it up, and it reminds me of, like, what they always say, not the youth is wasted on the young, but when you're young, you're afraid of nothing and you just jump in. Perhaps naivete is a portion of courage and people's moxie, and just not knowing to be afraid of something, or not knowing, like you said, you called up this guy in Italy, the head of it, and of course you were going to call him, you didn't know any better, type of thing. So maybe that's a good thing.
I think that I'm glad you made that point, because I was thinking, I wanted to make the point that when we're younger, we might do these things, we might call, or when we were older, we know the consequences, or we might be more self-conscious about what we don't know. I know it's true with like language learning and things like that. When we try to learn a language when we're older, we're more self-conscious, we're not brave, we don't just start chatting with people, and young people aren't like that. And so I think it's if young people have ideas to do things, it's probably good to do them get started doing them while they're young, before they get too self-conscious about what they don't know. I mean, what you're doing with this podcast is
I was just going to say that.
is moxie, right? What you're is pluck.
We didn't know what we were doing in the beginning.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
We're just going to do it.
We're just going to do it.
And it's great. And it's really admirable. And it's going to be interesting to see what you learn.
We've been learning quite a bit so far, mostly on the logistics and technical side, and what COVID can do to pivots that we have to make. But exactly, it's keeping that beginner's mindset, right? And the
Yes.
curiosity.
And just to be unafraid, I think is something at least I try to remind myself of, now having life experiences and having gone through certain things is, to try to use that naivete in a different way, that you're conscious of certain things and you have the experience, but you're still should not let that hinder you to take a leap or, forge forward. And just like, when Mary and I approached Mary about creating this podcast, she was like, I don't know. And I was like, Mary, it's just work. We're just going to figure it out.
Right.
And we're doing it. We're
Right.
doing it. I think that also plays into not over intellectualizing
Yes.
and listening to intuition or gut.
Mhm.
And having that mixture. Back to the paper people, they had some data and business models behind their planning, but the last step was the leap.
Yes.
There was a kind of gulf
Yeah.
in between that.
Right.
And
That's a good metaphor, actually. Yeah. The bridge, the leap, the whatever it is, jumping over the little the river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With that, was it, and sorry to cut you off, do you find that in the oral history that you've been doing and the research you've done in your career, listening to these stories about so many different individuals and in very different situations at different times in life, is it always just kind of that moment of jumping, the decision, like, I'm going to make this leap, and the courage to take that? Do you find correlation between that at those moments for those people?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the moments that we find very interesting, right? I think we find those the most interesting, the moments of the leap, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's all those other ones that they've been working on that we don't see.
Right.
And that may be true with everybody we're noticing. I want to go back to the beginner's mind, though, because it's reminding and being just not being afraid, just always being a beginner, right? That's sort of a Buddhist idea. You're just not always being a beginner and not being afraid of that and not being embarrassed by that.
Right.
Oh, interesting. Because so many people are afraid of that, and not looking or seeming
Yes.
like they're confident in something, or they don't know the answers. People are so afraid of that. Oh, I like that.
Yeah. A certain humility, like, I don't know this and I'm here to learn about it. I mean, that's
Right.
the wonderful thing about oral history or journalism or anything. You can ask, you're being
Mhm.
paid, not being afraid to ask, and that's what really appeals to me about oral history. It's interesting. I never really thought about it. We're supposed to be learning when we do this.
Mhm.
It's a job, it's work where you're always learning. It's what you're doing. So you might do a little research about the person you're interviewing, but you are asking the questions and the narrator is the expert. So
Right.
that's wonderful for a person who likes to learn, and you can always be the beginner.
I like that viewpoint. It's liberating in a way.
Yes, it's liberating. We're sort of taught in our culture to be, confident and appear confident. And maybe being confident is not knowing and not being afraid of not knowing. And people like to talk about themselves. So you can always ask.
Yeah, they do.
You're at a party, just ask, and you will never have to say a word for the rest of the evening, right?
That's so true.
I want to steer back to how we first met. You were bringing us the opportunity at Housatonic Valley Regional High School to be part of an oral history podcast. And we used some footage by a previous guest, Peter Vermillier, on Housatonic alumni through the decades. And watching you with the students was something I always marveled. And I would say to the students, you don't know. This working with Judith is an opportunity you might never get again. She is a mentor, and she is willing to allow you to take risks and fail, and willing to support you through that process. And do you realize that that's the kind of mentor and boss that you are?
No. And it's so interesting because I didn't know how to do a podcast when we started that. And so it was like flying without a net. And I mean, it was you were all wonderful because we learned together. I remember bringing in a couple of experts who told us about, just taught us. The students were amazing. I saw myself as actually kind of frightened because I knew about oral history, but I hadn't ever edited it. And so we had to bring experts in to edit and show us how to do the editing. And so the students were very patient, and I learned right alongside them.
But I think that model of leadership, I mean, it's not like you're running a corporation, but you were the leader,
Right.
is something that's really good for young people to see, that the
Yeah.
leader can be learning alongside the doer,
Yeah.
and that there's no shame in not knowing,
Yeah.
and that knowing where to find answers is often the key.
Yeah. Yes. Learning, being confident enough to go look. I mean, just looking for answers if you don't know them. It's okay to go look for, it's okay not to know.
Right.
Yeah. And we had experience with the student. I remember the second student, who was just, remember having real hard time figuring out the story because we had all these interviews, and she was the one who had to come up with the story for the podcast. Like, so we would meet with her, and she was throwing her hands up, but then she got it.
Yeah.
She got it, and she did a really good job. It was really impressive for all of us to sort of sit back and tell her, you're struggling. We know that. You will get it. Keep struggling. You will get it. You will get it. And she did. And that's really impressive.
Well, I think that is something that young people struggle with, is the struggle, that it's okay to feel uncomfortable and that you don't quite get it. And then having the patience to wait for the penny to drop.
Oh, that's an interesting concept, the penny to drop. I don't know that one. That's great.
Well, it's that aha moment when
Yeah.
you realize that oh, now that's the story, like brushing my teeth. Aha, that's what I'm looking for. And I think I remember sitting in those meetings, and my inclination is to suggest, but you were so restrained in letting the student come to that moment on her own. And I really learned from you.
Well, that's nice, Mary. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I thought we were very good. Peter, you and me, we were with that student. And I remember sitting in one particular meeting, and she was trying to figure out what is the story we want to tell here. And watching Peter, watching you, we all sort of played off each other. It was really nice that we all knew that she would be able to do it. But how to just give her our support while she was doing it.
Right.
I hope that was a good experience for her, because she certainly learned a lot.
I think it was for both our interns, the reverberations of that internship carry forward well into their college. So you did your job.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm still in touch with Abby. I haven't been, and Abby worked as an intern for us a couple of summers later. But Valerie, I haven't heard about her.
Well, she's doing well from
good
reports. So
can I ask something that we've kind of touched upon, the not knowing, but taking it another level? We've asked some of our guests, sometimes failure also defines a person's moxie or defines their character and how they're challenged and how they deal with it. Have you found both in, your work career as in the stories that you share with the world or bring back to life kind of in your oral history, do you find that some folks' failure stories have also defined them going forward and how they then find their courage and find their next level, if you will?
Yeah, I know that it definitely helps people if they can get out of the failure, if they can survive it. If they can survive it, they grow a lot from it. I know from my own personal failures, I've had that experience, without going too deep into the weeds there, but a divorce and sort of struggling with, I've certainly struggled a lot with what am I doing next in terms of my work. I'm not a great forward planner. Like 10 years from now, I'll be doing this. And then 10 years from now, that's what I'm doing. That's not how it works in my life. So so there's always a bit of struggle and failure, little failures. And then I'll tell you one time that when I applied for that Fulbright, I wasn't really the kind of person who normally got a Fulbright because it's an academic thing, scholarship thing. It's people in academia. And I applied and I didn't get it. But I got waitlisted. So that gave me great encouragement. So I went and found someone in Albany who was the head of the New York State Fulbright Association, an alum. And I said, would you meet with me and tell me how I can make a stronger application? And he did. Yeah. And I got it the next time. And so I think that like not giving in to not getting something that you really, for some reason, I really wanted that. It was very important to me. I knew I needed the time over there to live without making a living. I knew I needed that. And this was the way I knew to get it. And so I persisted. That was a little failure. I mean, you know, most people don't get things they apply for like that, but it was a little failure, and it sort of helped me do it better the next time. I'm sure that I have much deeper, profound failures.
Don't we all?
Yeah, I know I have, but that's a little failure that was definitely, and people I've interviewed, setbacks, definitely setbacks.
Well, perhaps failures, you know, too harsh a word, you know, setback or challenges, or, you know, I like the term myself personally is it's not meant to be, or I'm meant to take this just like you did with the Fulbright and wait a second, this is my stepping stone to do something better or look at myself better in the mirror, at least, you know, so perhaps failure is too harsh a word.
Well, it is. I mean, they are failures, but we somehow have a hard time with that word in our, maybe.
Oh, for sure.
We have a hard time with that word. We don't want to be that person, right?
Right.
No, it's so definitive.
Exactly. It sounds like it's over. A failure is over. Whereas
you're done. You failed. It's over.
Yes. And we have that word in our schooling.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't just not pass, you failed.
Oh, that hurts.
That really hurts, right? So maybe we need another word for that, because that's got to be devastating to fail things when you're trying hard to learn in school, third grade or fourth grader. And it's just, you're not good at testing or whatever the reason is, you're not showing that you're okay. You fail. It's terrible.
I think we have to amend that question, Mary, with a different word.
No, but it's an interesting conversation.
Well, just hearkening back to your years as a career counselor. So pursuant to this conversation on failure, there's a thing now called a failure resume, where you record, like you would for a resume for a job, your failures and what you learned from them. And then try to use that, because that's where the growth is, in those setbacks and the challenges and the failures. So I think it's very interesting that we have seen failures as a dead end, and yet they are the impetus for new growth.
Yes. So we didn't call them, resumes, but that was always in preparing a student for an interview of any kind. Always, a question that interviewers, especially sort of corporate, that sort of typical question type interviews. Failure. Can you tell me about a failure that, where you grew or something? So we always prepared students for that question. And so to have it be a failure resume, wow, that's
taking it to the next level.
Yeah. I mean, the danger in that, it seems to me, is that people start to tell their stories in some kind of like almost cliched kind of way. Like,
right.
It becomes like another part of their list. I did this community service. I had these failures. I had this, the whole sort of like, but yeah, it's an interesting approach. I think, I mean, being able to admit our failures in general is very, very hard. I don't know if it's a cultural thing or if we're more apt to be prone to that in our culture or not. Yeah.
So in wrapping up,
yes,
Thorin likes to finish off with
what kind of we referenced as Moxie advice, but what kind of advice would you have from your own personal experience, your own life story, as well as, since you are a collector of stories and a collector of lives in a way that you're bringing, I feel, at least, because I loved history. I have a degree in history. So I just loved, I loved learning about history, because I felt it was so important to understand what happened to bring us to today. So you are, in a way, I feel, from my perspective, at least, bringing what has transpired back to life in a certain way and sharing it from the very personalist perspective. So what kind of advice have you found from yourself as well as from the stories that you have brought back to life?
So first of all, the stories for myself, I would say, like we talked about earlier, do things when you think of doing them. And don't second think too much. I mean, when we're young, we tend to sort of make maybe more those leaps that you talked about, Mary. I'm thinking also about getting a team, having support. I have an incredible boss right now, Dan Bolognani, and I'm not just saying that because he'll hear this.
Shout out.
Which he will.
He allows little failures.
Yeah.
He lets a lot happen. And he's kind of an ambassador, and he's got this great diplomacy. And so he's an amazing person to have on the team, but also mentors. Like I would say, I've always in my adulthood, I was always hoping they would appear. I didn't always recognize them when they were there. Sometimes in retrospect, I think, wow, that was really a mentor. But I do have a couple of oral history mentors who were in the field a lot longer than I was when I started it. And I really rely on mentors. I think, but finding little bits of support, whatever it is. And if you don't, I guess you just sort of do it anyway.
And pick up the support as you go along.
Yes. Maybe just keeping an eye out for it is good enough.
Right.
Who's going to support me here? And, this is going to be tough. This leaping thing I'm about to do is going to be tough, but who might help me, or who will at very least not discourage me, or who will have, sound advice or whatever.
Well, that's great advice, Judith. And we want to thank you for participating in Main Street Moxie and look forward to hearing more stories from the Oral History Project. The link will be in our show notes, and hope it drives some people your way.
And I just want to say also that I don't think of myself as having moxie.
Well, moxie is not in the eye of the beholder. It's in the eye of the podcaster.
Okay. So I think it's going to be interesting to see for you who thinks they have moxie. Yeah.
Well, we are kind of telling people who we think have moxie. So they have to fall in line.
That's great.
But I think it's also, to add to that, I think that everyone does have it. It's just some people may not even recognize it. And, as you had to go define, look up the definition of it, there's so many different definitions. And I think people have to find it within themselves to identify it, and then identify it within themselves and in their own lives, as well as those around them. So I think that's kind of been part of our goal also. And that's why, I think it's interesting that you say you feel that you don't have it, but there are so many people around you who would definitely argue differently, including Mary and me. So, but that's part of it.
I just want to say one more thing, and you can cut it out. I mean, it's just something I'm just thinking when you were saying that, Thorin, I was thinking about students who are shy or not popular.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the moxie that takes to persevere and do your own thing when you're not like the star? Or when you're not even like part of the group, or you're an outsider. It must take an incredible amount of moxie just to get through,
It does. And just to have that inner strength to still be true to yourself.
Yes.
And that's all about moxie.
Perfect.
And on that note,
thank you so much, again, Judith.
Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend.
Mary, there are so many parts to this interview with Judith.
I know.
We didn't jump too much back and forth, but a little bit. But I want to start with what I found to be so interesting was that she does not think that she has moxie.
I also find that interesting because I just see it in her so much. Yeah. And hopefully we convinced her that she actually does have more moxie than she thinks.
I think it has to do with towards about 2/3 of through the interview that some of her oral history, what she was talking about is the people that she's telling the story of and sharing the story of, and most of it's moxie stories, but to them it was just something you had to do. And I think Judith is also an example of that she just went about because this is the next thing she wanted to do, or just for survival in some cases. I'm not necessarily saying in her case, but in some of the stories she shares, and it's just a natural thing. You just do the work.
Yeah, that was a real aha moment for, I think, both of us.
Yeah.
That when people are behaving in a way that might be considered as demonstrating moxie, they're just doing what needs to be done. And that was a real telling part of that interview. I think the other thing that was interesting was her emphasizing a reframing of what failure means
For sure.
and what we call it.
And I think it made us, have to examine in this, not just this episode, but in this show, about maybe we should restructure that question. Maybe we should not use the word failure, because I think, as Judith pointed out, it's so definitive to some people, and it's like, oh my God, I failed. It's the end. But I think you and I more meant that question as, oh, this thing didn't work out, or whatever it was, so we pivoted, or something didn't work out as we planned. So it's not necessarily failure. So for you and I think we're just gonna, in the next interviews, maybe we don't use that word, but we work around it and find a synonym or something.
Yeah, challenges, setbacks, pivots. I mean,
there you go.
When you think about the times when you learned something about yourself, it's not when you did something really well. It's really when you had to dig deep and come back from it.
For sure.
Those are two things that Judith taught us. And I think the other thing, just through the Housatonic Heritage Oral History Center, is she's taking and archiving the stories of people that are both seemingly ordinary and famous. And she is creating a bank of moxie.
Yeah.
So we're grateful for Judith on a number of levels. And I'm happy she came on the show.
So happy, and I'm excited to hear what our listeners think. They could leave us some comments on our website or in the social media, and give us our thoughts on Judith.
And you can read more about Judith in the show notes. All right, Thorin, till next time.
See ya. This episode is sponsored by Northeast Ford and Catskill View Weddings.